Happy Monday, everybody. Hope you're all doing well. We're on to week 6 of Aetherdrift, and this will be my last best of 1, best of 3 meta review for Aetherdrift until we get the Tarkir set in early April. So every Monday, what I like to do is go over the top 8 top performing best of 1 decks according to Untapped from Diamond to Mythic, and I will use a third-party tracker to remove my bias. And then I will also cover the tournament winners from the Standard Challenge on Magic the Gathering Online for Best of 3. Since a lot of the stuff that happens in Best of 3 eventually trickles its way down into Best of 1. So, with that, I'd also like to say thank you for everybody who's joined the community and has helped me as a YouTube member. I greatly appreciate it. I also highly recommend checking out the budget builds that I spent a bunch of time on. Hopefully you find them helpful. Building 16 decks that are just commons and uncommons was quite the task, but I did have a really fun time doing it. And, I think for the constraints, they're decent, right? So, hopefully that's a useful resource. So with that, let's get started though. So Mono Red Aggro is number 1 this week, according to Untapped. It is in tier 1, and we're going back to the version that is running the lightning strikes over the shock. And basically this is the same version that was run in Worlds back in October. So there's really not much to talk about here. We'll just kind of buzz through it. I do like to cover the matchups, so we'll talk about the matchups really quickly in case you are new or returning to Magic the Gathering. This is a really great deck to craft for beginners, by the way. So it's favored against Domain, it's favored against Gruul Aggro. Because Gruul Aggro is a similar strategy but has a little bit more increased mana variance. And Domain, it's a lot of pressure for Domain to handle. And it's a coin flip against Esper Self-Bounce. That one kind of depends on what removal they draw and when. Azorius Control is also a coin flip, having a little bit more sweepers, which can shut this strategy down, as well as it depends on if they're running Elspeth Smite. It's also a coin flip against Azorius Omniscience, whether or not you're... One thing to note is the version that is running the shocks instead of the lightning strikes makes it easier to hold up 1 mana to disrupt their Abuelo's Awakening. So something to consider if you're coming up against a lot of Azorius Omniscience, you may want to run the shocks instead of the lightning strikes. And then we've got Golgari Midrange is a coin flip too, and that one also comes down to whether or not they draw their black removal and are able to ice the mice. So it's weak against Mono Black Midrange, which has plenty of interaction to shut this strategy down. It's also weak to Boros Auras, which the life gain is a little bit of a problem, sheltered by ghosts. If they get that down, can be really hard to answer with this strategy. And then it is also weak to Rakdos Aggro, where Rakdos Aggro is a very similar strategy, but wins a turn sooner because it's not running cards like the Burst Lightning and the Lightning Strike. It's just more of a pure aggro strategy and wins on turn 3 instead of on turn 4. And the opening hand, too, in case, again, you're new, I like to go over this each week. The Heartfire Hero or the Hired Claw starting on turn 1 is important for this deck. And then the Manifold Mouse and the Emberheart Challenger for turn 2 to follow up are quite nice. And this is part of the mice package that you will see a lot of in Best of 1. All right, and number 2, also in tier 1 from Diamond to Mythic, was Azorius Omniscience. And it is the exact same list as week 5, so last week's list, same thing, same sideboard too. So if you want more details, refer to that video. It's favored against Esper Self-Bounce, not really having a lot of creatures for that strategy to disrupt. So it's favored against Mono Black Midrange for the same reason, and it's favored against Azorius Control for the same reason, and it's same with Domain and Gruul Aggro. So the coin flips, though, are Mono Red Aggro. That one really comes down to whether or not you have the Afar's Dispersals and the Philology Archaeologist, and who has the play. Boros Auras can be a coin flip for this deck too, because there's the temporary lockdowns help against that matchup, but that's kind of your one answer to the Shelter by Ghosts. And then Mardu Aggro can also give this deck a hard time, depending on yeah, if they, just like mono red, it depends on how quickly they can pressure you before you get your turn 4 combo off. And then it is weak to Rakdos Aggro, which certainly can pressure before turn 4 enough that the deck can struggle against that matchup. So the opening hand, you're looking for Omniscience. Having the copy of Omniscience in hand allows you to treat Chart a Course basically as a copy of Omniscience, so it increases your chances of getting it into the graveyard. And then if you do get one into the graveyard, you can play a second one once you animate the first one, and this allows... so if your opponent has an answer for the 1/1, then they also have to have an answer for the Omniscience the second Omniscience that you're playing. Ablaze Awakening is the combo piece that this whole deck is built around, so that's a nice one to have in your opening hand. And then the Temporary Lockdown is particularly nice for surviving the early threats, like Mono Red and Boros Auras. And then the Chart a Course, like I mentioned, helps it so that if you draw an Omniscience, then it kind of acts as a duplicate copy, right? So... Number 3 in tier 2, which means it's a standard deviation below the other two. It is also by popularity quite a bit lower. Right now, Mono Red and Azorius Omniscience in Diamond and above are the two most popular picks. And you may have experienced that if you did play in the best of 3 standard qualifier, had a lot of Mono Red and Azorius Omniscience as well. So Rakdos Aggro is coming in here. It's no changes from week 5, and it's favored against Mono Red Aggro, and it's favored against Domain, and it's favored against Azorius Omniscience. So this is like the meta breaker, if you will, right? It's favored against Golgari Midrange, it's favored against Gruul Aggro. It's a coin flip against Azorius Control, and then it's a weak against Mono Black Midrange, Esper Self-Bounce, which have enough... It's even weaker than Mono Red is to the removal in black. And then Boros Auras is also a problem for this deck because of the life gain. Sheltered by Ghosts can be really problematic for this one because you don't even have the Shock or the Lightning Strike to shoot the target. The opening hand for this one, you're looking for your Heartfire Hero and your Emberheart Challenger. Some lists run the Manifold Mouse, some don't. That one's a decent one to have if you have the Heartfire Hero or the Emberheart Challenger. And then after that, you're looking for Monstrous Rage and Turn Inside Out. These are your best combat tricks for hitting the turn 3 win off of either the Heartfire Hero, the Cacophony Scamp, or the Slickshot Show-Off, which you're flinging with the Callous Sellsword. Number 4 is Boros Auras, also in Tier 2. I guess the rest of them will be in Tier 2. So this one does see some slight changes from week 5, and we've seen this time and time again. This one is going back to the Atali's Favor version and dropping the Monastery Swift Spears. So when you do that, you bring in more lands. So we're seeing the 2 Thran portals coming in for a single mountain. And then we've got the 2 Atali's Favors and the 4th copy of the Feather of Flight. So this strategy is favored against Mono Red Aggro and Golgari Midrange, Rakdos Aggro, and Gruul Aggro. So this one's like kind of a counter to half of the tier 1 decks, but then also targeting the Rakdos Aggro on the ladder. So like, you get into the rock, paper, scissors kind of thing of the meta. And then it's a coin flip against Domain, Azorius Omniscience, and it's weak against Esper Self-Bounce, Mono Black Midrange, and Azorius Control. So if they have the single point interaction like Mono Black, then you can ice the target of your Sheltered by Ghosts. And the opening hand for this one, you're looking for the Heartfire Hero. We're starting to see a theme here. And the Sheltered by Ghosts, as well as the Manifold Mouse and the Optimistic Scavenger. Mono Red Goblins continues to have some changes throughout the weeks as well. So if we compare this one to week 5, we see that they've leaned... It's kind of somewhere in between the 2 decks, right? So this one is bringing in the Cacophony Scamps, but I guess I'll walk through it, right? So we've dropped 3 mountains, we've dropped 1 Cacophony Scamp. Some lists have dropped all of these, some of them include it, depending on whether or not you're more of aggressive or more leaning into the Krenko build. It's dropping the Dropkick Bomber, which is the Lord, and it's dropping the 1 copy of the Lightning Strike and the 1 copy of Squee, and the 4 copies of the Grease Wrench Goblin. And the Grease Wrench Goblin is the 2/1 for 1 red that can exhaust to discard. And with that, we're bringing in a 3rd copy of Krenko. So some have 2, this one is going with 3. And then 4 copies of the Fanatical Firebrand. And I'm not sold. I mean, the reason why I do this is to remove my bias, right? But personally, I think the Grease Wrench Goblin is pretty appealing over the Fanatical Firebrand. This, however, is good at getting rid of Heartfire heroes. So if you're coming up against a lot of the Mice package, the Fanatical Firebrand may be advantaged over the 2/1 Grease Trench Goblin. So this one is running Agatha's Soul Cauldron, which we saw originally back kind of early on in the evolution of Mono Red Goblins. So we're back towards leaning towards blowing everything up with Krenko. Because if you have if all of your goblins have haste, you can tap Krenko to create a whole bunch of goblins, put the 1/1/1 counter to give Krenko's ability to another goblin, tap it to do it twice in one turn, and this can just take off, right? This can just absolutely be a game-winning card. So we do have the 3-tree city, which we saw explored as a way to have additional mana based off of the amount of goblins that you have. And we also see a full playset of the Draconautics Engineer. This one goes down the more that you're going towards the aggro strategy that's not as good as Mono Red, and comes up the more that you're leaning into Krenko, which I think is where this deck is advantaged over Mono Red, is that it's good against Mono Black by going wide, right? It loses to Mono Red because it's slower. So you kind of have this give and take, right? And then we have the Amonkhet Raceway to lean into the start your engines mechanic, and that one we also saw kind of explored at the beginning of Aetherdrift. So we've kind of come full circle, and so this match is this strategy is favored against Mono Black Midrange because of the go wide, and so it punishes the single point interaction that gets rid of one card for one card, and it's also favored against Azorius Control, where you have enough sweepers are a little bit of a problem, but as long as you're playing around it, it can be okay. And then it's favored against Azorius Omniscience, being able to close out the game fast enough. And Azorius Omniscience has that Afara's Dispersal and the Pelagia Archaeologist, which works well against Mono Red. Less so against Goblins because of going wide. And then it's also favored against Golgari Midrange. So it's a coin flip against the Esper Self-Bounce decks. It's a coin flip against Domain. And then it's weak against Mono Red Aggro. Again, Mono Red, sort of like how it's like Goblins, Mono Red Aggro, and then Rakdos Aggro. Rakdos Aggro is the fastest, right? So Goblins is more of like turn 4, turn 5. Mono Red's pretty consistently turn 4, and then Rakdos Aggro is pretty consistently turn 3. So I lost my place. Oh yeah, Boros Auras is a problem for this deck for the same reason that Rakdos Aggro is bad against, is that you don't have a really great answer to the Sheltered by Ghosts. And it's also weak to Rakdos Aggro, because like Mono Red Aggro, it wins before this deck can. So the opening hand, you're looking for the Howl Squad Heavy, the Seer Slicer Goblin, the Cacophony Scamp, and the Burnout Bastronaut. Alrighty, we're on to number 6 here, which is Mardu Aggro. This is one of my personal favorites. This one, we do see some changes from week 5. Actually, we have to go back to week 4, I think, is when we talked about Mardu Aggro last. And so this one, we're dropping a Plains and 2 Rock-Based Villages, and we're dropping the Boros Charms and the 3 copies of Burst Lightning. So we saw a little bit more of a Boros Burn being played last week, and this is going back towards the Boros Auras build that's running the Callous Sellsword. So we're bringing in the 2 Mountains, and we're bringing in a second copy of the Callous Sellsword. We're bringing back in the 4 copies of the Feather of Flight, and we're bringing in the 1 Sun Billow Verge. And we've seen some decks running a full playset of this, and for whatever reason, their win rate seems to be a little bit lower. And I think it's because of, like you'd think that you could just take out 3 more planes for the Sun Billow Verge and it wouldn't have a dramatic effect, right? But like the tracker shows something else is going on, so who knows? But anyway, if you have that included, I can't imagine that being a bad choice in paper. And so this match is similar to Boros Auras. It's favored against Mono Red Aggro. It's favored against Rakdos Aggro. It's a coin flip against Domain, Azorius Omniscience, Boros Auras, and Golgari Midrange. And it's weak against Esper Self-Bounce, Mono Black Midrange, and Azorius Control for a lot of the same reasons that Boros Auras is. So its opening hand, you're looking for the Heartfire Hero, the Sheltered by Ghosts, the Optimistic Scavenger, and the Manifold Mouse. All right, number 7 is Dimir Self-Bounce, and this is the first time that we've actually seen Dimir bounce in the top 8. So Esper Self-Bounce has always been performing better than Dimir Bounce, and so this is the first week that that's not the case, and Dimir Bounce is actually performing better. So it's sort of a new archetype if we talk about it in Best of 1. Clearly, we've talked about it a fair amount in Best of 3. So this is the Esper Pixie deck is pretty well known at this point. You're using things like the Fear of Isolation and This Town Ain't Big Enough to bounce your Storm Chaser's Talent, your Hopeless Nightmare, and your Nowhere to Run for additional value over and over. The point of playing blue without the white is so that you can play the Enduring Curiosity with the double pip blue, and that gives you additional card draw, right? The Flood Pit's Drowner we also see in this, and this one's kind of being pulled over from the Dimir Midrange build. Gives you some decent interaction. That's also a decent one to bring to bounce back. And then we've got a little bit of disruption with the Spell Pierce and Go for the Throat for the targeted removal. And then your flyers, also like Spyglass Siren, is a really great way to ninjutsu in the Kaido Bane of Nightmares. So this archetype is favored against Boros Auras. It's favored because Nowhere to Run answers Sheltered by Ghosts like no problem. It's favored against Azorius Control because of how much value you have through the loops. It's a difficult deck for Control to deal with. And it's also favored against the Rakdos Aggro because of the being able to attack their resources, right? Nowhere to Run at flash speed is fine for shooting a slick shot show off out of the air, for example. It's also a favored against Mardu Aggro for same reasons as it's good against Boros Auras. So it's a coin flip against mono black midrange, Esper Self-Bounce, and Azorius artifacts if you are bumping into the Simulacrum synthesizer decks. It's weak against mono red aggro, domain, and Azorius Omniscience because you have really no way of affecting the graveyard. And the opening hand, you're looking for the Storm Chaser's Talent, the Spyglass Siren, the Kaido Bane of Nightmare, and the Hopeless Nightmare. So 1-drops and then Kaido. Okay, and we're on to the last Best of 1 deck, and it is Selesnya Auras. I can't remember your name. I'm sorry I'm blanking on your name, but somebody from the community pointed out that I didn't include Selesnya Auras in my budget build this time around. I did back in November during Duskmorn, but this time around I wasn't impressed with it because of how much Nowhere to Run answers the Sheltered by Ghosts strategy, as well as the Selesnya Auras strategy, which leans more heavily into Ward with the Honor Guard and the Toadstool Admirer. So I apologize. It is still a very viable deck and a good budget option because you do not need to run the Anthem of Champions or the Calyx. And in fact, Anthem of Champions is one that I haven't really seen in this archetype. But you know, I haven't really visited it since Foundations, right? So it's, I think it's a good inclusion. So you should try it out, see how it runs. It has the enchantment synergies, so I imagine it's a good fit. So this archetype is basically a different version of the Boros Auras strategy, but doesn't have the mice synergy, and is instead having a better interaction against the single point interaction. It's still weak to mono black midrange because Nowhere to Run is able to cut through this, but theoretically, it's easier to get your Sheltered by Ghosts down. The problem after that is that like there you don't have something that's really building into a Voltron at the same speed that you do with the Heartfire Hero. So craft with a grain of salt, right? Or craft with care. This one is favored against mono red aggro. And so if there's a big spike of mono red aggro, which is pretty common at the end of the season to climb into Mythic, you know, you could farm the mono red, and it's also good against Azorius artifacts. This one is, you know, it's good against the Simulacrum synthesizer decks because you just the artifact decks struggle against the Sheltered by Ghosts, taking out the Simulacrum synthesizer. Whew. Anyway, so it's weak against mono black midrange, Esper Self-Bounce, domain, Azorius Control, mono black discard, Golgari Midrange, Boros Auras, and Azorius Omniscience. So it's definitely not a really great meta pick, and we can start to see kind of a little bit of the format has been solved, if you will. Like it's hard to beat mono red and Azorius Omniscience, which is why it was so popular in the Best of 1 or Best of 3 qualifier. So. The opening hand, though, you are looking for Sheltered by Ghosts, just like in Boros Auras. Ethereal Armor is particularly important to this strategy to be able to actually get into a sizable threat. And then Optimistic Scavenger is as well, for the same reason. And then Calyx Guided by Fate is the real reward for being in green-white as opposed to red-white. Calyx being able to copy things like the Ethereal Armor every time that you connect with one of your creatures can be absolutely backbreaking. All right, and on to best of 3. So best of 3, I like to do the standard challenge, and we're going to be talking about just Saturday and Sunday's tournaments because there were 2 on each day. So sorry, Friday, you're getting shafted this week. So Golgari Midrange by Tchuko took down first place on Saturday 22nd, and if we compare this, we have to go all the way back to the 7th week of Foundations. It was the last time that we saw a top 8 by Golgari Midrange. Now, it's been there, it's been in the tournament scene, it's by no means has it been dead, it just hasn't taken it down a standard challenge for quite some time. So it's tweaked the lands a little bit. We dropped two swamps and a forest. We also dropped a Go for the Throat and a Cut Down, and we also dropped the 1 copy of the Maelstrom Pulse, and notably all 4 copies of the Deep Cavern Bat. And if you notice, note that trend because we'll come back to it in a different deck as well. The Deep Cavern Bats get better the more people are cutting like the 4th copy of the Cut Down, right? So this is a signal that a lot of people are running the cheap interaction, and so they decided to drop the 4 copies of the Bat. And they're also dropping the 1 copy of the Duress that was sometimes included in here, the 3 copies of Shieldred the Apocalypse, and the 3 copies of Glissa the Sunslayer. And instead, we're bringing in 4 copies of the Sentinel of the Nameless City to really pressure, to help out against like Gruul Aggro and Mono Red Prowess, or Mono Red Aggro. Same with the Gix's Command to be able to wipe the board as well as give us lifelink. And the 2 Archfiend of the Dross is another one that's also kind of a stab at mono red. Worse off against when you have like the Glissa Sunslayers that can remove all the oil counters and whatnot, render inerts and such, which we have seen kind of fall away. We've got 1 additional Anoint with Affliction for removing problematic blockers and threats. We also have 1 Shoot the Sheriff, which has actually played pretty well. I've seen a lot of trends. You'll notice in a lot of my builds in the budget lists, I included 1 copy of Shoot the Sheriff. It's kind of the trending right now, if you will. And then we've got the Terra Sunder for a little bit of artifact and enchantment hate. So the best of 3 sideboard also got a pretty substantial rework. So we're down 2 copies of the Terra Sunder, and we're also dropping the 2 copies of the Blot Out. So Blot Out was being included because Thrune was a common pick for a while there. We've kind of seen that disappear, and we've also got 1 less Scavenging Ooze, so the Ghost Vacuum being the graveyard hate of choice. And we've also dropped the Vivian Reed, which gave us repeatable artifact and enchantment hate. We've moved the Gix's Command from the sideboard to the main, and we've also dropped an Anoint with Affliction from the sideboard to the main. And we've also dropped 1 copy of the Tranquil Frillback, which is another way to give yourself the artifact and enchantment hate, graveyard hate, and life stabilization against like mono red. So some people really like the Tranquil Frillback. And instead, we're bringing in 2 additional copies of Duress. This points to there being more control, primarily Azorius Control. Just being able to need to get rid of the sweepers like Sunfall for this deck to not just completely collapse, and was part of the reason why Golgari disappeared for so long was because of the Sunfall in Domain. We've also got the Cut Down, the 4th copy if we're up against the aggro matchup, Harvester of Misery for the go wide strategies, Obstinate Balif for Helpless Nightmare in Esper Pixie, and the 2 copies of the Choking Miasma to also hate on the go wide strategies, and 2 Ghost Vacuums for the graveyard hate. Mono Red Aggro also took down 2 spots, so Mono Red Aggro by MAFS took down 2nd place on Saturday 22nd, and then also took down 1st place on the same, on the tournament on the 22nd as well, but that one was by Mashiro RC. But it was the exact same list. If we compare this one to week 5, we can see that they dropped the 3 copies of the Sunspine Links, which is more commonly found in the sideboard. If you're expecting a whole bunch of Domain and Esper Pixie, then it makes sense to have the Sunspine Links in the main, which is what we saw last week. So instead of those 3 copies, though, we've got the 2 copies of the Lightning Strike and then a 3rd copy of the Soulstone Sanctuary. And this was more popular to include the Soulstone Sanctuaries in best of 3. We saw it in best of 1 for a little bit of a moment there. Personally, I think that, I agree with the tracker on this one, where I've played it with and without, and I personally like it without. Because with the Rockface Villages and the Soulstone Sanctuaries, it can actually be kind of tricky. You kind of end up, you can end up with a hand where you have like 2 Rockface Villages and a Soulstone Sanctuary, and then, you can't cast any of your spells. So, but I digress. So if we look at the best of 3 sideboard here, we can see that they went through a couple changes as well. So we've dropped the 4th copy of the Lithomantic Barrage. This one's good, obviously, against white and blue. We've dropped a 4th copy of the Torch the Tower, which is good against other aggro matchups. We've dropped a Obliterating Bolt from there, which is good for Preacher of the Schism and Sentinel of the Nameless City. We've also dropped 2 copies of Pyroclasm, which is good against the go-wide strategies, and the 2 copies of the Urbrask's Forge, which was also trending. We started to see mono-red including it more, largely because we saw a spike in Dimir Midrange. Three of the top 8s were taken down by Dimir Midrange last week. So Urbrask's Forge is being taken out of this one. We've got the 3 copies of Ghost Vacuum, though, coming in for Graveyard Hate against, Azorius Omniscience combo decks, Jeskai Oculus, that sort of thing. And then we've got the 1 copy of Witchstalker Frenzy coming in. Personally, I like Witchstalker Frenzy the most when you can shoot your own Screaming Nemesis to deal 5 damage to face directly, which is more punished by black removal. If you go for that line and they go for the throat, you get 2 for 1. So usually when I see a little bit more of like a 4 Witchstalker Frenzy option is because you're not up against black. And then we have 3 copies of the Sunspine Lynx, which, as I mentioned, was good against the Esper decks and Domain decks. Anything that's running a multicolored mana base, the Sunspine Lynx can then punish that. We also see the return of Gruul Leyline. And so Gruul Leyline took down 2nd place, because remember the mono red got 1st place with the same list. And so this one was by 5s, and if we compare this one, we have to go back to week 4, but it is the exact same list in the main, and in the sideboard, we see that we dropped 2 copies of the Lithomantic Barrage, so also not anticipating as much white and blue. We dropped the 4 copies of the Questing Druid, and the 3 copies of the Paw Patch Formation. And the Paw Patch Formation is for, the Artifact and Enchantment Hate, whereas the Questing Druid is for additional dig and is good against the slower matchups. And instead we're bringing in Pick Your Poison, which gives us that Artifact and Enchantment Hate, but in the form of a Edict instead of, it's also 1 cheaper, and a sorcery. I think the Paw Patch Formation might be an instant. I can't remember. But anyway, we've got the 4 Leylines of the Void. And so this is the Graveyard Hate, so 3 copies of Ghost Vacuum and 4 copies of Leyline of the Void. I'd say people were anticipating a lot of graveyard combos. There's a fair amount of stuff that cares about your graveyard too, like I mentioned, Azorius Omniscience, Jeskai Oculus, as well as the Golgari Self-Mill strategy that we saw on the Pro Tour, right? So I love this, though. We're just deciding to bring this in, even though we have no chance of actually hard casting it if we don't have it in our opening hand. So you just bring all 4 in and mulligan heavily for it if it wins you the game, right? And then we have the 3 copies of Count on Luck, which I really like. So instead of the Questing Druid for Dig, we're going for the Count on Luck. A little bit harder to cast maybe with the primarily red, triple pip red, but what we have seen in the past too is that this deck can go completely mono red, right? So all of these are able to tap for red as well as green. So we are kind of a mono red deck, which allows us to play the Count on Luck. So okie dokie. Now we're on to the Sunday's tournament, which is going to have the Standard Challenge and the Standard Showcase. So Azorius Control took down 1st place on the Standard Challenge on Sunday, March 23rd. And we also have to go back to week 4 to talk about Azorius Control. This one changed a couple of things from what we saw the build that was brought in the Pro Tour by Arne. And so this one is dropping a Plains. It's dropping the 1 copy of 3 Steps Ahead. It's dropping the Overlord of the Mistmoors down from 4 copies to 2, and it's also dropping Rides In from 3 copies down to 2, and getting rid of the Deduce, and also getting rid of 2 copies of Demolition Field, and 1 copy of Sunfall, and 1 Sunken Citadel, and 1 Tashana's Tidebinder. So sorry, it's a lot of one-ofs, but it's kind of little tweaks here and there, right? And instead, we're bringing in a third copy of the Day of Judgment. We're bringing in a second copy of the Blast Zone. We're bringing in 2 copies of Elspeth's Smite to help out against mono red. We're bringing in Hornblock Whale to also help out against mono red. We're bringing in a 4th copy of Get Lost. I mean, this one has such versatility, it's hard to say it's for a specific matchup, but if you're running against creatures, enchantments, or planeswalkers, we've got a Meticulous Archive for a little bit of Surveil, the 4th copy of No More Lies for Counterspell, 4th copy of Beza, which is also against the aggro matchups. It's nice to have all 4 copies. And then we have the Darker Waste and the Seachrome Coast, 2 additional copies of the Seachrome Coast, or no, sorry, 1 copy of the Seachrome Coast and 2 copies of the Darker Waste. Whew. Anyway, largely the same strategy, right? Disrupt your opponent, win through Overlord of the Mistmoors. So the sideboard also got a rework a little bit, so we're ditching 1 copy of the Devout Decree, which helps out against like the black or red, the black planeswalker of Kaido, for example. We've got the Elspeth's Smite has been dropped 1 because we've moved Summon to the main. This one's not running any of the Wiltleaf Liege, so Wiltleaf Liege was included for the Esper Pixie deck. We're not running the Jace in the sideboard, so we're just sticking with the 3 copies in the main and not having the 4th as an option. We're also dropping Kutzel's Flanker, leaning on the Rest in Peace instead. And we've also dropped Beza from the sideboard, as well as Authority, the 1 copy of Authority of the Consuls, which was to help out against aggro as well. And we instead have the Mazemind Tomes. So a lot of people are debating about whether or not you should have the Mazemind Tome or the Deduce. The Mazemind Tome gives you more value the longer the game is going, so it's better against the other aggro matchup, the other control matchups, whereas Deduce is better against mid-range, where they're more likely to play around your counterspells of No More Lies and 3 Steps Ahead. Aggro, they're about the same, right? The Mazemind Tome can give you the life gain, so I personally like it, but I could also see, because they're not going to play around your counterspells. And so the Deduce is usually hard to get off because you're kind of dead. You don't want to be casting either one, really, right? You want your Elspeth Smites. So the Disdainful Stroke is being brought in here. This is a classic one against domain strategies, even because the impending, you still can, its mana value is higher than the impending cost, right? Which is why it works with Up the Beanstalk. So this is great for the domain Zur deck. Destroy Evil as well, gives you the enchantment hate. Boonbringer Valkyrie is a common choice against the aggro matchups. Tishana's Tidebinder is really good against Azorius Omniscience, and anything that you add the Esper Pixie deck, anything that has a good activated or triggered ability. Remember, you can also silence Kaido with this, because Kaido has hexproof when it's a creature, but if they go to activate it, then you can silence it with the Tidebinder. We've also got the Perilous Snare for an O-Ring, and then we also have the copy of the Rides In that used to be in the main, has been moved to the sideboard. So if you are up against a creature strategy, then you're going to bring in the Rides In, whereas this is a dead card if they aren't playing any creatures or vehicles. And second place was taken down by Jeskai Convoke by Manny, and if we compare this one, we have to go all the way back to week 11 of Foundations. So the end of Foundations, we saw a little bit of the Jeskai Convoke strategy. And we see that they dropped the Spirebluff Canal Down one. We see that they dropped in a Darker Wastes. Lands are important to keep track of as well. And we've got the 2 spring-loaded Saw Blades have been removed. Same with the 2 copies of the War Leader's Call. Mockingbird has been removed, as well as Arabella, the Abandoned Doll. And instead we're running Mirrex and the Regal Bunnycorn. And, this is a classic one to include for all of the permanents that you can spam the board with. So this is kind of an older inclusion, if you will. We also have the 2 additional copies of Case of the Gateway Express, which was originally a full playset, was kind of like the way to be prior to rotation, right? And so this one is better against the more that you need removal. And then we've got the one additional copy of Sheltered by Ghosts to help out against mono red or the Gruul Prowess, which this deck can struggle against with. And then the Nesting Bot gives us the alternative to the Ocean Frontliner, and it's a pretty decent inclusion for this archetype. So the best of 3 sideboard also got a minor tweak. So we've dropped 1 Rest in Peace, going down to 2 copies, which is my preference in the first place. And then we've also dropped the 2 Sheltered by Ghosts, which have been moved to the main. We've also got the Spell Pierce has been included. So this is the one that we got. This is the copy that's in Neon Dynasty, right? We got this one again in Aetherdrift, so bringing that one in. And then the 2 Wiltleaf Liege to punish the Esper Pixie discard of Hopeless Nightmare. Okay, and now for the biggest tournament of Sunday, which was the Standard Showcase. And first place was taken down by Gruul Mice by Pierre 2025. Sorry. not my best. So this one, if we compare it to week 4 as well, we can see that they dropped a Copperline Gorge, the 4 copies of the Carplusian Forest, the 3 Torch the Towers, and the 3 copies of the Innkeeper's Talent, and the 3 copies of the Pop Hatch Recruit. And if you go back far enough, there's a version of Mono Red that was basically like Mono Red with Questing Druids in the sideboard, and that's what this is basically, right? We've got and additionally Pop Hatch Formation, but it's basically Mono Red. And so we're bringing in the 5 Mountains, we're bringing in the 2 Monastery Swift Spears, we're bringing in the 2 Shocks, we're bringing in the 2 Lightning Strike, and the 2 additional copies of the Burst Lightning, and the Witchstalker Frenzy. So we're leaning more heavily into the red interaction than the green value, right? And because we're doing that too, we can bring in the Rockface Villages because we have more red, leaning into the mice synergies. And the best of 3 sideboard, we dropped 2 Pot Patch formations and a single Pyroclasm to bring in the Torch the Tower. So again, you're going to bring this in against like the other aggro matchups. And then we have 2 Ghost Vacuums to give us some graveyard hate. And the last deck of Aetherdrift to wrap it all up before I take my break is Esper Self-Bounce. And I think it's a pretty fitting one to be the last one for best of 3. I think it's certainly the most infamous strategy that kind of showed up during Aetherdrift. And Esper Self-Bounce is... so this one was by Pepe Team, went 2nd place on the Standard Showcase. And if we compare this one to last week, we can see that they are running the Optimistic Scavenger list version, so dropping all of the Optimistic Scavengers, also dropping 1 Darker Waste, to bring in a Restless Reef. Instead of just relying on the Restless Anchorages, we also have the ability to mill. And we're also bringing in a 3rd copy of Kaido. Again, this is better against midrange and control, worse against aggro. And Defiled Crypt, which is better against the mono-black strategies like the Mirror. Anything that's looking to answer your threats, you can bring them back with the Defiled Crypt. And then we have 1 copy of Preacher of the Schism, which helps out against aggro as well. And the best of 3 sideboard, we've dropped 1 Duress, 1 Pest Control, which is the sweeper for going wide, 1 Anoint with Affliction, and the 1 Defiled Crypt has been moved, and then the 1 Stock Up that was being explored has been moved. We also see the Wilt Leaf Liege for the mirror match, if they're not going to side out their Hopeless Nightmares. We also see the Shieldred the Apocalypse coming in here for, I think largely against a Dimir Midrange or Dimir Bounce, where they have a little bit more of that card draw. You can then punish that with the Shieldred the Apocalypse. Also helps out against stabilizing against mono red. We also have a Break the Spell. This one was once upon a time was favored over the Destroy Evils for against like Zur enchantments or domain, and we kind of have like a split here. So take your pick which one of these you want to bring in. And then we also have the Preacher of the Schism, so we can bring in a 2nd copy if we're up against aggro. So thank you once again, everybody, for listening to my ramblings. I hope they find you well. It's always a joy to do these little rundowns of each one of these decks. I do love talking about the meta and geeking out about Standard. I think that it's been in a really good place. We'll see what they do in Tarkir. Always interesting to see if they address problems like Azorius Omniscience and Mono Red. How best of three will shift. We see kind of a turnover of we see a pretty healthy meta in best of three, in my opinion. But anyway, with that, let's see. We have, yeah, like I mentioned, I did my budget decks yesterday, which was an immense amount of work, and hopefully will help people out who don't have enough wild cards to actually craft all of these meta decks that I'm talking about. So trying to appeal to as many people, trying to help as many people as I possibly can. Appeal, who knows, right? And then I'll be doing a gameplay video, which will be the last gameplay video of Aetherdrift. Again, I know not everybody likes it because it doesn't have commentary, but I do like to showcase some of the decks and how I have been approaching them. So Mono Black Skeletons will be this week, and then this Friday I'll be doing my pre-release for Tarkir. So I like to do that one a week in advance for those who are going to be playing Sealed the following weekend. And then, yeah, I'll be going to be taking a little bit of a break, and then you guys will see me again on April 8th, the Tuesday of the release on Arena, to talk about my Tarkir builds. And then the following Monday, we'll be back to Best of 1, Best of 3. So if you like this every week, you might have to be a little patient for, you might have to say goodbye for, what would that be, 3 weeks. So take care, everybody. Thank you again for everyone who has helped me as a YouTube member and joined me as a part of the community, reached out in Discord, talked to me on Twitch. I love it when you guys reach out and talk to me and I get to know you. So that's always been fun. So I've rambled enough, and thank you all again. Have a wonderful time crushing the ladder and crushing your RCQs, and I will see you all for the pre-release guide on Friday. Take care.